Okay, so in my last video with Mimi Partisan Girl, a lot of you guys got mad at me because we were specifically talking about the Kurds, and you thought that was an endorsement of the Turks, which was not. I just wish people would understand, whenever I interview someone or talk about any specific topic, like the Kurds, because we don't talk about Turkey, does not mean an official endorsement. And if you do watch this YouTube channel, you could see me being very critical of Mr. Erdogan and the Turkish government. But regardless of that fact, in this video, me and Mimi actually do talk about Turkey. I lay out my understandings of the Middle East and what's really happening. She lays out hers. But most importantly, Mimi, Partisan Girl, gives us her new predictions about the future of the Middle East, because as we know, years ago, when the Syrian conflict just started to begin, she gave out predictions that were on point. With her research, with her hard work, and her sources on the ground, she was able to correctly predict the current situation that the world is in, facing off inside of Syria. And now she tells us what's going to happen in the future. Here's the video. I kind of wanted to ask you, because we knew from the very beginning of the Syrian supposed revolution, or this kind of rebellion that happened, that it was Turkey, the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia that were arming the supposed civil war. They were arming the rebel groups. Right now, we just saw Donald Trump piss off Turkey out of their alliance where they previously supported radical Islamic terrorists and those rebel groups. Why would Donald Trump, in the bigger picture, prefer to align himself with the Kurds, pissing off the NATO ally Turkey that previously was arming the rebels, including ISIS, inside of that region? What is the bigger picture here? And is this a bigger ploy to kind of balkanize Syria and make it into multiple states?
Well, balkanizing Syria has always been on the agenda. They've been talking about it openly. The US, at least, has been talking about it since the Iraq War. And Israel has been talking about it for decades. Israel in 1982, one of their think tanks brought out something called the Yunon Plan, where they talked about creating divisions in the Middle East, using Shiites against Sunnis, against Kurds, and in the hope to create separate states, only one of which was this Kurdistan. But the reality is the US wanted to cut Syria up even further, but has had very limited success in anywhere but that northeast region. And that is because even though Kurds are only 1.6 million of Syria's population, the fighting force is coming not just from Syria alone, but it's coming from the 15 million Kurds, in Turkey, the PKK, which the US has designated a terrorist organization, and the Kurds in Iraq, the Peshmerga. So they have a lot of fighters coming in from the porous border. You know, ISIS comes in through that border, and so does the Peshmerga and the PKK. So why the US, sorry, back to your question, why would the US willingly, like, push under the bus a NATO ally and, you know, in support of the Kurds? And, you know, if a naive interpretation would be because Turkey has been supporting the terrorists all this time and the Kurds have been fighting the terrorists. But that's a very naive interpretation, because the US has been supporting the terrorists alongside Turkey. So it wasn't Turkey's idea to support Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. It was a joint cooperative thing that they were doing alongside Obama.
Yeah, and then Russia even exposed them. Yeah, and then Russia even exposed them for buying ISIS oil and also allowing the border to be open to allow rebel fighters to fly into Turkey and then go right into Syria. And that was a joint plan with the United States. And now it seems like that plan has been totally cut.
Well, no, that plan is still a plan. I mean, the US is still trying to protect the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda, in the west of Syria. I mean, while they claim they're fighting ISIS, they're still trying to protect Al-Qaeda in the West. So the idea that the US is angry at Turkey because of their support for terrorism, that's not the case. You know, the US was okay with it. The reason the US prefers the Kurds is because it benefits Israel. It's not because it benefits the United States. they would rather benefit Israel in the long run than they benefit the United States, because it seems to be that the Israel firsters in the US government and in the deep state are in control. I mean, if you look at what happened with Trump when he said America first, they said that that's basically this akin to being a Nazi, because back in the day, you know, America first was seen as being against the Jews, and they're saying that America first is anti-Semitic. So if America first is anti-Semitic, that means that they really want Israel to be first. And that just happens to be a lot, like the Israeli lobby dominates the United States. And so they would push them to do, just to support anarcho-communist, which they designate terrorists, in order to balkanize Syria. Because to divide Syria from the regions where most of the oil is basically a step towards starving the Syrian people and making sure they're always going to be weak and never going to be able to resist Israel. Because Israel has long-term objectives to steal a lot more Syrian land than it's already stolen. And people might call that a conspiracy theory, but they basically talk about it openly. It might not be in the near future, but they are planning it for a long term. And their plans is that Israel should be everything from the Nile to the Euphrates. And that is why they have planned that the Kurdish region is past the Euphrates, because they don't want the Kurds to cross the Euphrates. That's why they have the Euphrates shield thing, because they want to claim everything west of the Euphrates. And so the Kurds can't have that, basically. But, you know, NATO, the most important country in NATO is basically Turkey, because of its positioning, its power, its population. That without Turkey, NATO would be nothing. And so by basically pissing off NATO, you know, it's quite, I mean, NATO has always been a tool of war, but it's quite outstanding that the US would, do this to its ally. And it just goes to show that the influence of the Zionist lobby is so powerful. When Trump was getting elected and he was talking about how NATO is outdated and, you know, all of this stuff against NATO, I considered that there's a faction inside the deep state which was backing Trump, which basically had given up on balkanizing the west of Syria and is just sticking to balkanizing the northeast of Syria. Seems to me that faction was more conservative about how much of Syria they can balkanize, and it seems to me that that faction has lost to the other faction that wants to balkanize all of it. And in order to balkanize all of it, they have to continue to play nice with Turkey and NATO. So I'm sorry, this is getting very complicated. So
It is, but that's why I decided to have you on to kind of explain these kind of situations, because we can make quick videos about them, reading the news and breaking them down, but it's really such a dense perspective that really needs fine-tuning in order to understand the bigger picture here. And we have seen Israel's foreign policy, especially with the moves that their military has been making against the Syrian government, bombing Syrian military forces, not being attacked by any of those radical rebel groups, even ISIS inside of their own country, but giving them treatment, giving them medical aid. We have seen also Israel look at the Golan Heights region, which is contested land between Israel and Syria, and kind of see that as a benefiting factor. And I think more of the destabilization of Syria does work in favor of Israel, but also Saudi Arabia, who wants more of a kind of Sunni-dominated Middle East and wants Iran out of the picture, since both those countries are fighting against each other. Turkey also sees a big interest in this by grabbing more land away from the Syrian government. The United States interest, a lot of people kind of speculate that it's about this pipeline that Saudi Arabia wants to build, but I think there's even a bigger picture here, and seeing Donald Trump so closely connected connected to Henry Kissinger for a year now that we have been reporting to you, kind of signals this kind of Vietnam era continuation of the war. This is what we talked about in yesterday's video, that ultimately leads to more chaos, more war, more conflict, and this war not ending anytime soon. Now, with Russia in this picture, we see their clear interest with Iran, with trying to keep their military bases, with also trying to keep their faction in the Middle East cohesively together. But am I incorrect on any of those kind of analysis when I'm looking at all those countries in the world? With also, I have to mention China coming into Syria and backing the Syrian government. That's how I personally see it, and their kind of global interest throughout the world. How do you see it?
I think that you're mostly right. There's a few things I'd like to talk about. The Golan Heights, it's not contested. It's, UN recognized Syrian land that is occupied by Israel, but Israel would like to annex it. And they've been talking about how it's time to annex the Golan Heights, and we just need to put in more illegal settlements in the Golan Heights. So they're definitely benefiting. They've basically been supporting Al-Qaeda on the Golan Heights border. They admit this. The chief of the Mossad has admitted that they have been giving medical support to Al-Qaeda on the Golan Heights. And a lot of Israeli politicians have come out and said that they would rather ISIS win in the end because it benefits them. Because ISIS is on the Syrian and Iraqi border, and they have a very beneficial thing that they do, which is separate Syria, Iraq, and Iran by standing there in the middle, like this festering wound. So that is why ISIS benefits Israel. And if you look at ISIS, they have been basically instrumental to a lot of these agendas. If ISIS didn't take over these areas near the Kurdish regions, then they couldn't have come in and taken that land off ISIS. One of the Kurdish officials told of the Iraqi regional government, Kurdish regional government, told The Guardian that ISIS gave us in 2 weeks the land that we wanted for 8 years. So there's definitely some benefits that they've had from creating ISIS, but it's more so to pave the way, but eventually they plan to somehow get rid of this. The other thing I'd like to say, about the Kurdish use of female soldiers, the problem with some of that is the fact that they force them to join when they're underage girls, and sometimes even kidnapping them from their own families. And this is something that is that one of the women's magazines got in trouble for glorifying female child soldiers in their magazines. I think it was Mary Claire. But it's something that's definitely been happening, because what they do is they get these girls and boys at a young age and they indoctrinate them into the ideology of, anarcho-Marxist and ethnocentric Kurdish state. And if their parents try to get them back or get them out, the whole family gets harassed. So that's why a lot of Kurds have ended up as refugees, because they're basically stuck between ISIS and, these militias that are, kidnapping their kids. So it's a really hard situation for the Kurds, actually. But yeah, well, with Russia and Iran and China, Russia is closer to Syria than it is with Iran. In fact, Russia's relationship with Iran is basically kind of mitigated between Syria. And sometimes it's a little bit rough between them, and Syria steps in. But Iran is still important, it's quite powerful and it's very highly populated. So Russia would prefer it on their side. But as far as I can see, Russia is in it for Russia. And so I have to sometimes be skeptical of the things that they do. I mean, not everything that Russia does has been the right, or it hasn't always been beneficial to Syria. So it's always been beneficial to Russia, though. So we have to be very accurate about that, because at the end of the day, Russia has its own Zionist lobby, and that Zionist lobby also can sort of stop Russia from doing certain things. So, for example, Israel can continue to get away with lobbing missiles at Syria, and nothing seems to happen to it. And Netanyahu always meets up with Putin either before and after. Or, for example, Russia fails to give Syria specific arms till a certain day because Israel has a problem with it, and the Zionist lobby in Russia is making problems out of it. And finally, the situation with the Kurds. The Kurds don't necessarily threaten the Russian base in Tartus. So even though it might be something that the Russians would be willing to negotiate with, because it puts pressure on Turkey. And I think what I can see is there's a battle going on right now between Russia and the US and Turkey. Russia is basically making it appear that that this Kurdish thing is going to happen. And if Turkey wants to stop it, then they should be allied to Russia and not the United States. So Russia, while the US is happy to throw Turkey under the bus for the sake of a Kurdistan, Russia is waiting in the reins to swoop in and take Turkey out of NATO and finally get Turkey on its side. And that's how come you can see that Turkey and Iran and Russia have made an agreement in Astana. Whereas like 2 years ago, Turkey had shut down a Russian jet and they were at the brink of war. Now they're becoming closer and closer allies, because at the end of the day, Russia would prefer to be allied with Turkey than to be allied with the Kurds. But they're playing this game and they're, reaping the benefits while the US is throwing this away for the sake of Israel.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that there's no kind of righteous or right side in this kind of proxy global warfare, since there are interests at hand and we are dealing with war. But looking at the situation, I more wanted to also talk to you about kind of Donald Trump, because when he was campaigning, he was promising a lot of things. He promised not to support the rebel groups, and now he's training the rebel groups on the Jordanese border, having U.S. soldiers get in there. He said that he wanted to mainly defeat ISIS, but now he's also giving heavy weapons to the Kurds, pissing off the Turks. There's a lot of different moves that are being made by Donald Trump that are a complete 180-degree turn of what he promised when he was campaigning to be president of the United States. What do you see his kind of bigger end game, and is he continuing the same policy of Barack Obama, or is he making it worse?
I think he's continuing the exact same policy. The only thing is that he hasn't yet, but he will probably start arming the Kurds in the northwest of Syria in Idlib, because that's something that he stated since the start, that we don't know who these people are. Some of them are terrorists. We don't want to do what we did with Al-Qaeda. So these things might be hard to backflip on, but basically, all that happened with Trump is that he delayed Clinton and Obama's policy for a few months. And yes, I've always considered the possibility that he would backflip. I used my words very carefully. I said, now that he's elected, let's see if he does what he says he will do. As soon as he got elected, I said that, he would be better than Hillary, but wasn't sure if he was going to be actually good. He obviously promised that he wouldn't start World War III. And these politicians are always breaking their election promises. So I suppose by saying that he's not going to start World War III, maybe that means that he will start World War III. So we shouldn't have been so surprised. I mean, I think the surprising thing is how vehemently he said these things and how impassioned he was when he said them, and then how quickly he did a 180. I think that kind of gymnastics is what's very jarring. But it's very revealing as well, because it reveals how deeply the deep state is entrenched and how limited, the US democracy and US elections are. It seems that they're completely and utterly pointless. And these people yelling at each other about who is the better president, they're just wasting their time. It's ridiculous. And at least that this has exposed that. So I would say that if, there's that way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is possibly, while the elections have always been more of a selection by the deep state than an election by the people, possibly there was a faction within that deep state that didn't want to bring the US to the brink of World War III and wanted to be more conservative with what the US was going to achieve. And that faction was pushed out within the first 3 months at the end of the election. Maybe Michael Flynn, the general that was opposed to starting a war with Russia, as soon as he got out of that picture, it seems that Trump no longer held those views that he did earlier on about ending regime change wars and fixing the United States up, focusing on fixing up the United States. So it seems to me that he's completely a puppet of whoever is around him, sadly. And perhaps it was foolish for us to think it would change, or maybe you didn't think it would change.
Ever since I saw him with Kissinger and say that he hangs out with Kissinger and gets advice from Kissinger, I was like, wait a minute, just hold on there. I was always very skeptical, and you could see the kind of progression we made on this YouTube channel throughout the months, especially during the campaign. Definitely Hillary Clinton was the worst of the worst, but now we're finding out that there's a bigger picture and a bigger play being made here. And I think especially with the big turnaround that Donald Trump made with Saudi Arabia. Having a public Twitter fight with Saudi Arabian princes before, saying that the United States won't be dependent on Saudi dirty oil and how they were partly responsible for 9/11. He was going on Saudi Arabia, and now we're helping them destroy Yemen and the Houthi rebels inside of that country, fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, and yet the mainstream media doesn't see that as a controversial issue and doesn't even mention it to the American public, which I find very disturbing, since our tax dollars are being used to finance this operation, which is creating more terrorism, more conflict, and more shenanigans all over the world. I mean, I talked to Max Egan about this, and we're even thinking that all the countries are involved just to create a bigger divide and conquer, just to create a bigger conflict, just to con the people, to scare the people, just to have a big mutual enemy in order to control everyone. I kind of am entertained by that ideology, but I know you kind of see it differently, because you've been able to actually predict what was going to happen years ago, and you've been dead on, and you've been right years ago predicting the current situation that we're seeing inside of Syria now. And I want to kind of leave it with my last question, asking you, where do you see things going ultimately from here?
Well, with Saudi Arabia, Trump's backflip was amazing. He's now recently seen hanging out with the Saudi Arabian monarchy, and Israel's relationship with Saudi Arabia has been better than ever, and the other Gulf Arab state, Qatar, they've been meeting with them regularly. Qatar and Saudi Arabia happens to be the biggest funders of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And if you consider that Israel is what Israel really is an extremist religious state. It's a Jewish state in the same way that ISIS is the Islamic State. So why would they be against Saudi Arabia and ISIS? It's basically a mirror of what they are, So basically the Middle East, what the agenda is by these powers is to divide people up into different religious sections. You know, as here, the Jews here, Muslims here, Sunnis here, Shiites here, Alawites here, Druze over here. The Christians, just get rid of them. They don't, for some reason, they don't want to have any Christians left in the Middle East. And that's why they always prioritize Christian refugees over any other religious sect, because they want to get them out the fastest. So that is one side. That is what they want. They want to balkanize the Middle East on ethnic and religious lines so they can continuously fight amongst each other for centuries to come, so that the powers that be can completely destroy them. And in so doing, what they would like to do as well is to drive populations out of their ancestral homes and into the West, as well as getting Westerners to go and work in the Middle East, in Dubai and Saudi Arabia. And the end goal is to get rid of borders altogether, to get rid of the idea of a nation state. Because to the globalists, borders and taxes have been in the way of building these monopolies and these economic empires. They would like to be the ones in control of the whole world. And to do that, you have to have one government and no borders and no cultures and a McDonald's everywhere and a H&M everywhere and everything looking exactly the same. That's one side of it. And then you have another side of it. So this is one thing that can happen. Another thing that could happen is that Syria right now, the Syrian military has made a deal with Russia, Iran, and Turkey that Turkey would stop its insurgents from fighting the Syrian army in the west of Syria, while the Syrian army in that time can concentrate on fighting ISIS to get to the city of Deir ez-Zor, where there is that Syrian airbase that the US accidentally airstruck. If they can get to Deir ez-Zor, the balkanization plans will fail, because Syria will have air supremacy over the whole region, and US troops will not enter a place where Syria has air supremacy. That is basically why this invasion plan from Jordan is happening, and why the US and the Kurds are basically allowing ISIS to leave Raqqa to go towards Deir ez-Zor, because the US wants Deir ez-Zor to fall to ISIS. They don't want the Syrian army to control it. And if you notice, whenever ISIS fights the Syrian army or Russia, they always fight to the death. But whenever they fight Kurds, you know, for some reason they always are having a deal to just move off somewhere else. And ISIS recently moved their capital from Raqqa to Deir ez-Zor, even though they don't even control Deir ez-Zor. So why would they make that their capital? It doesn't make any sense, other than for the fact that these people are controlled. This terrorist organization has state funding, and that state is more than likely Saudi Arabia. So that's what we're going to see now. We're going to see Deir ez-Zor being the main focus of the next few months, the battle between the forces that want to keep Syria together and the US that want to, the US deep state that want to break it apart, because it's run by these globalists. That term is, you know, it's, some people criticize it because it doesn't specify who they are. But for now, you know, it really means people who want to control the world and aren't nationalists in any way.
Fascinating breakdown and analysis. I know this hasn't been easy because these are very complex situations that have so much information to deal with it, but thank you so much for breaking this down. Mimi, Partisan Girl.
I haven't bored your viewers.
No, you haven't, because I'm like me, I'm a nerd about this. I'm at the edge of my seat listening to everything, because this stuff matters, and the deeper picture here, getting a full perspective on it from someone who has sources on the ground there, is extremely important, because this is, I think, 1/10 of what we hear on the U.S. mainstream media, if that even. And I want to thank you for your great work that you've been doing throughout the years. Your predictions have been dead on, and if people want to see more from Mimi, Partisan Girl, the link to her YouTube channel will be in the description below. She also has a Patreon page where she's raising funds for her independent media organization, so definitely check out Partisan Girl in the description below. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for being on this YouTube channel and giving me your excellent analysis and perspective. It means a lot. Thank you.